Good afternoon, this is Pavel Stelmach on UATV channel explaining complex things in simple terms. The 59th Security Conference ended in Munich. The main topic was, of course, the war against Ukraine, and the collective West is unanimous in Ukrainian support. World leaders have recognized that the Russian Federation is committing crimes against humanity, and Ukraine needs even greater military support. For example, US Vice President Kamala Harris emphasized during her speech that Russian forces are conducting large-scale and systematic attacks on the civilian population of Ukraine. No doubt that these are crimes against humanity. Their actions are encroachment on our common values and encroachment on our common humanity, she said. And NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg emphasized that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin's plans have not changed. He does not seek peace. Therefore, Stoltenberg called to provide Ukraine with everything necessary for victory as a sovereign, independent state in Europe.
It will be a tragedy for the Ukrainians, but it will also be dangerous for all of us. It will be a message to all authoritarian leaders all over the world that when they use military force, they achieve their goals, and that will make the world more dangerous and us more vulnerable. So it is in our security interest to support Ukraine. The other lesson we can learn is the need to invest in our security. Even if the war ended tomorrow, it has changed our security environment for the long term.
But whose security the war has already changed is that of South Korea. South Korean Foreign Minister Park Jin said that Russia's attack on Ukraine gave North Korea courage. Russia's armed attack on Ukraine and the world's attention to the war in Europe, as we have seen, are embroidering on regime of the Kim Jong-un in North Korea through aggressive missile launches, including intercontinental ballistic missiles. At the same time, another major Asian player, China, offers peace talks. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi addressed the participants of the Munich conference with a call for peace and dialogue. China plans to propose a peace plan for Ukraine. At the same time, officials said that the US is watching China try to publicly portray itself as a proponent of peace and supportive relations with Europe, while quietly aiding Russia in military operations and considering lethal aid.
How can we see a permanent member of the Security Council and one of the leading powers of the world? Of course, we believe that China can play an important role in containing Russia's aggressive intentions, and actions, given the relationship that China and Russia enjoy. We always had good relations and good trade with China. I'm looking forward to the conversation with Mr. Wang Yi. We are going to have a meeting here in Munich to go into details. We think China can play a role. We want China to play a role that will reiterate the principle that is fundamental for both China and Ukraine: territorial integrity. No concessions, no compromises are possible with regard to territorial integrity of Ukraine or any other nation in the world. And no peace plan can be based even on the slightest assumption that a square meter of Ukrainian territory can be considered.
One of the most important speeches in Munich was the speech of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He stated that Russia will lose this year and there is no alternative to Ukrainian victory in the war. Although, according to Zelensky, Russia still has the potential to destroy Ukraine, so any delay in supplying weapons to Ukraine is a mistake. Putin is trying to buy time to bargain with the world, and he can still kill many people. Therefore, we must increase our efforts because more active. We must speed up the delivery of weapons to Ukraine. At the same time, Ukraine is convinced that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is afraid of losing himself in his state. And this is what will turn out to be a defeat for him in the war against Ukraine, which the Kremlin started.
Що він не буде зупинятись Україною, він з'їсть, якщо
He will not stop at Ukraine. If we break, he will continue to eat other states that were once in the USSR. Therefore, his steps are completely understandable. He understood that the speed with which you and we started working affects our victory, which means his loss. His loss on the battlefield is his loss within the state. That's what he's afraid of, losing himself in his country.
At the same time, in my opinion, the latest statements by European politicians that the victory of Ukraine should not lead to the collapse of Russia is irresponsible and a refusal to recognize the reality that can cost Western civilization dearly. With few exceptions, the Western world imagines life after the end of the Russian-Ukrainian war to the same as it was before. So we need to create discussions about what kind of model of a conditional tomorrow has been caused by the tectonic changes in geopolitics that have occurred in the last year. So this is no awareness that the Russian Empire is in the final stages of its disintegration, and artificial containment of its collapse will only prolong the crisis and create new cataclysms, as then torn with such force that it can destroy many. But instead of taking this process under control and preparing for the challenges that await us in connection with the collapse of Russia, the Western world continues to infantilely cling to the old life, with Russian gas, Russian oligarchs, and the mysterious Russian soul. Today I would like to talk about the revolution of dignity. After all, it was during these days that the key events for Ukrainian statehood take place 9 years ago. At the end of 2013 and at the beginning of 2014, mass protests began in Ukraine against the policy of the government and the rejection of European integration pay. They led to the change of power and the flight abroad of the ex-president Viktor Yanukovych and his associates. The culmination of the events was a mass confrontation on the Maidan of Independence in Kyiv on February 18-12, 2014, as a result of which 107 protesters and 30 policemen were killed. On February the 17th, 2021, the Verkhovna Rada recognized the Revolution of Dignity as one of the key moments of Ukrainian statehood and an expression of the national idea of freedom.
Це була перша битва фактично російського.
It was the first battle of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the battle for our values, for European values, for freedom. And honoring the heroes of the Heavenly Hundred are those narratives that Maidan laid at that time. Its victories is something that stands across the throat of Russian authoritarian leaders.
The unification of Ukrainians in 2014 made it possible to defend their rights, freedoms and values. Even then we showed that we will not follow the whims of one person or a group of people, even though they were previously elected. This is called democracy. We elected President Yanukovych, but we went to protest when we disagreed with his activities. Now we can only assume what our country could be like if the president and his people had heeded the call of the people and not started dispersing rallies. If Ukrainians, despite the mortal danger, did not stand on the Maidan for their right to decide the future fate of the country themselves, it was there that our nation was hardened. After the victory on the Maidan, many people volunteered for the war against Russia in the Donbass. Yes, in difficult times for our country, the neighbor, and as he calls himself, elder brother, Russia, hit us in the back, annexed Crimea and started the war. At the same time, it attacked insidiously, sent its troops secretly without identification marks, and at the same time telling that it was the local population. But you can't hide the truth. A few years later, Putin himself admitted that it was them. He even gave out medals for the return of Crimea. And there is some perverse logics in this. After all, on February 19th, 1954, Crimea became part of the Ukrainian SSR, after which the real development of the entire peninsula began. And in 60 years, Russia began an active phase of annexation. At the same time, it has been conducting a subversive policy in Crimea for over 20 years.
We must do everything to ensure that Crimea returns home by summer, and Crimea will be returned to us. I'll tell you more. It all started in Crimea in 2014, and it will all end there. Kirill Budanov, chief of the main directorate of intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, in an interview with Washington Post.
In 1991, we gained independence, de jure, and in February 2014, we won it de facto. And then we accepted the first battle, a battle that is still going on now. The whole country feels more than ever what was in the hearts of our heroes, and if it wasn't difficult for us, we will manage. After all, during the Revolution of Dignity, we realized that we cannot be indifferent, because indifference kills the most. That is why the whole world is currently surprised by our involvement in repelling aggression, in volunteering, donations, the number of volunteers in the army. We have also learned not to be silent when it is necessary to speak, when injustice is nearby, and we also realize that our statement, "I am a small person, nothing depends on me," is wrong. Even if I am a small person, I can do a lot, and in the end, we have no right to give up when those who came before us did not. And I call on the whole world not to give up and support us. Only together we will be able to defeat the evil that is coming to us from the Moscow swamps. The creator of the Wagner Group and, until recently, an influential Russian politician, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has disappeared from the information field. Now, he is also removed from the prison recruitments. Prigozhin is also removed from the information field of the country. Russian television talk shows were instructed not to mention Wagner PMC and its creator Yevgeny Prigozhin anymore. About the future of Prigozhin and Wagner PMC, we will speak with David Petraeus, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency of the USA. Tell us, please, will the US declare Wagner as a terrorist organization? I mean, not only criminal, but terrorist organization.
Well, it certainly seems to me to be a terrorist organization. Again, I'm not sure what the legal ramifications of that are. That's a little bit beyond my expertise as a former general and former CIA director. But the nefarious elements of the Wagner Group, the brutality, the various elements for which they are known, their reputation and all the rest of that, around the world, not just on the battlefield in Ukraine, are beyond reprehensible, frankly, and clearly merit the kind of recognition that you're suggesting.
What impact will the US sanction have on Wagner? How do you think?
I think that it can limit some of their activities around the world. They will certainly try to circumvent sanctions, as have other individuals and groups, including a number, of course, in the Russian Federation. But it would be a constraint on what they're able to do, and that would be positive, given the nefarious nature of what it is that they do as a mercenary group. Again, not just on the battlefield in Ukraine, but of course, elsewhere in the world as well.
Is Prigozhin fighting for power and authority in Russia right now?
It does appear that he is trying to increase his stature, his influence, and his power in Moscow by showing that his force is one that can achieve on the battlefield with what Russian conventional forces have not achieved. Keep in mind, of course, as you well know, but maybe not all of those who will be in your audience know, the Russian forces fighting in Ukraine are not all Russian Federation forces. The bulk of them are, but there are also, of course, the forces of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, or whatever their title are. So again, local forces. And then, of course, you have the forces of Prigozhin. You even have the Chechens to a degree as slightly separate from the Federation. And certainly Prigozhin has been trying to elevate his profile, his reputation, to achieve greater influence and ultimately perhaps greater power through these different activities.
It is then dangerous for Putin, how do you think?
It could be. And it appears that Putin and his defense minister Shoigu and perhaps his chief of the general staff, General Gerasimov, recognize this, because Putin has sought to elevate Gerasimov, to elevate the Ministry of Defense, which Prigozhin, of course, has been criticizing on a regular basis. Prigozhin has shown an ability in social media to attract followers, the so-called mill bloggers in Russia, many of them are supportive of Prigozhin and of his activities as the leader of the Wagner group, more so than they are of the Ministry of Defense, and some of them have been outright critical of the Ministry of Defense. And it appears that Putin recognizes that this has some elements of danger, and he has sought to show, first and foremost, that he is actively engaged as the commander-in-chief of Russian forces in the war in Ukraine, and also that his Ministry of Defense is firmly in charge. His chief of the general staff, of course, is now not just the chief of the general staff, but the overall theater commander for Ukraine as well. And that does seem to reflect, again, some concerns about the high profile that Prigozhin has achieved, both in the normal press, but even more so in social media.
Is it possible to say that Putin's power is beginning to decrease and now there is a struggle for power in Russia between his close and people around him?
I'm not sure I would go that far. I think he still very firmly controls all of the reins of power in Russia. He's not just an authoritarian ruler, he's a dictator and also a kleptocrat, because, of course, he's stealing from the state as well as controlling it. And those around him are all there because they have been intensely loyal to him, and they have been enriched by that. And I tend to doubt that any of them are seriously considering a coup or something like that, or that there is some kind of power struggle that involves Putin at this point, even though there is a bit of a struggle between Prigozhin and Defense Minister Shoigu, for example. But of course, the challenge when you analyze something like this, having been the director of the CIA, is that authoritarian dictator leaders seem to be very, very solid right up until they're not. And if you think about the leaders in the Arab Spring who were toppled very suddenly, think about the longtime president of Egypt, for example, Mubarak, 30 years, or Tunisia, similar, or Gaddafi in Libya, or some of the others. Again, it seems inconceivable that these individuals could be toppled until all of a sudden it is inevitable. So I'm very, very cautious about predictions about the fact that Putin could be toppled or that his power is diminished a bit, or that there is a power struggle. It's very hard to see that from the outside, number one. And frankly, number two, I do not at this point in time, based on what is available to us, see something like that going on, although you might, again, suspect that there are at least whispers behind the scene, given the extraordinary costs of the war in Ukraine on the battlefield, but also on the home front in Russia, because of the personal, economic, and financial sanctions and export controls that have been imposed by the US-led Western coalition. We should also keep in mind that, of course, Russian forces have lost at least 8 times the number of soldiers in Ukraine that they lost in Afghanistan, noting that they were in Afghanistan for nearly 10 years and Ukraine has been 11 months. And of course, what the United States, NATO countries, other Western countries should be trying to do is provide everything possible that Ukraine could use and employ effectively to hasten the day when Putin recognizes that the war in Ukraine is unsustainable because of the losses on the battlefield, and also unsustainable because of the damage that is being done to the Russian economy and financial system as well.
And at least one more private military company is appearing in Russia. What does it mean, and can they start fighting among themselves?
Well, again, if there is some kind of power struggle, independent military capabilities, if you will, in a sense, street muscle, will play a role in whatever kind of struggle takes place. So far, we see the elements of the Russian Federation, at least, being very strongly united behind Putin. Again, it's possible that one of these private military companies could play some role, but very hard to do that within the Federation, I think, as long as Putin has control of the many different military and intelligence and security forces that exist in the Federation. But again, this is why we watch this. This is why we are focused on what Prigozhin is doing, not just on the battlefield in Ukraine and in other locations where Wagner Group forces are engaged in the Middle East and Africa and so forth, but also what he's doing in social media, how he's trying to to gain the support of the so-called mill bloggers that are active on social media in Russia and are largely permitted to do that. Although they typically do not criticize Putin, of course, although they have at times criticized the Ministry of Defense.
And the last question, how do you see the future of Yevgeny Prigozhin?
Very hard to say. I taught economics along the way at various points, and you can never go wrong by answering a question by saying it depends. And it does depend. It depends on how well or poorly the Wagner Group does on the battlefield in Ukraine. Right now, it seems to be in the process of culminating, in other words, running out of offensive capability around Bakhmut, and touch wood, hopefully it will fall. That will happen short of seizing Bakhmut, despite having made some incredibly costly incremental gains in the areas around Bakhmut. But again, it depends. Could they reconstitute? Could they make progress? Could the Wagner Group demonstrate great capability? Could they achieve great results somewhere else around the world where they are active? These are the kinds of factors on which all of this depends, I think. And then how much does Putin accept his support or start to try to constrain and restrict the activities of Wagner and of Prigozhin on the battlefield in Ukraine, or try to get them completely under the control of the Russian Federation's military.
Thank you, Mr. Petraeus, for the interview. I remind you that it was David Petraeus, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. It was Pavel Stelmach on UATV channel explaining hard scenes in easy terms directly from Ukraine. Stay safe and stay tuned for more.